Okay, so good afternoon. My name is Michael Ennis. I'm the Vice President of TESOL Italy, and I would like to welcome you to this panel today on diversity, equity, inclusion, and accessibility in English for specific purposes. The purpose of this panel today is to sort of reflect upon the application of these themes in ESP, the extent to which they're being applied across the profession, the extent to which they're being applied in classrooms, and one second. Good. And yeah, so we're going to have a moderator who's going to ask our panelists a series of questions. First, I would like to mention that this is a joint endeavor by the English for Specific Purposes intersection of TESOL International Association, as well as the ESP Special Interest Group of IATEFL. This is great from our perspective because TESOL Italy is, of course, a longtime member of TESOL International Association, a longtime affiliate of TESOL International Association. And for the last few years, we've also been an official affiliate of IATEFL. And so it's great that we're collaborating at the highest levels of the associations, but also among these intersections. The panelists today, I would like to just very briefly introduce them. I'm not going to go into their bios because we have really an all-star panel here today. I will just briefly talk about their connection to TESOL, to TESOL Italy, to IATEFL, and to the intersections and special interest group. So we have Andy Curtis, who was TESOL International's 50th president. He's, of course, a well-known, very renowned scholar in all things of TESOL, but he also has a keen interest in ESP. Jack Hardy, who was the past chair of the TESOL International Convention. He's also a member of the TESOL ESP intersection. Kevin Knight, Kevin Knight was a past chair of the TESOL ESP intersection. And in my opinion, he's the glue that holds the ESPIS together. He is the most consistent and most active member over a decade. He's really the one who mentors the newer chairs and holds everything together. Gemma Pryor, who is one of my colleagues at the Free University of Bozen Bolzano. She, on this panel today, is our official representative of the IATEFL ESP SIG, but of course, she's also a member of TESOL Italy. Deborah Suarez, who is president-elect of TESOL International. You're probably very familiar with her work. She does a lot of work in advocacy and policy. Her area of expertise is not ESP per se, but she does a lot with workplace and professional contexts when she's advocating for multilinguals in their teachers. And so she'll bring a very interesting perspective to the panel today. As I already said, my name is Michael Ennis. I'm also the chair of the TESOL ESP intersection. I am one of the co-moderators today, but in reality, the main moderator today is Jennifer Roberts, who is the immediate past chair of the ESPIS. And with that brief introduction of our panelists, I would like to turn everything over to Jennifer, who will engage our panel today. Thank you.
Thank you, Mike, and thank you once again, everyone, for being here. So my role in this panel will be to be the moderator. So if you hear me ringing my virtual bell or getting us on the move, you know that's why, all in good intention to get us through the questions. So I'd like to start by asking early morning for me, but I would like to ask a question to everyone on our panel. So feel free to answer whoever is brave and would like to go first. But to all of our panelists today, can you just briefly describe your relationship between ESP and DEIA? And in doing so, maybe provide your own definitions of those terms, ESP and DEIA. Any of our panelists who would like to go first?
Okay, I'll jump in here, Jennifer, if that's okay.
Thank you, Kevin.
Let's see, actually, I took some notes on this as I was thinking about that, and I'm going to probably answer this much differently than everybody else will. I see ESP program development in terms of leadership, creating and achieving visions, and there are many stakeholders involved in creating ESP programs which address the immediate communication needs of learners for work or for their training. So programs are created, quality is negotiated, the creative process is enhanced by diversity and inclusion. Multiple perspectives are valuable in all stages of program development, from needs analysis to implementation to assessment, and flexibility may be needed to get multiple perspectives. And just one quick example, in one of the ESP project leader profiles, the featured leader, Kitty Johnson, was explaining how she was prevented from interviewing the park rangers that she was going to be training. So she conducted informal interviews with guests to the park in her needs assessment. And I'll stop there. So that's just to get us started.
Perfect. Thanks, Kevin. Anyone else? Maybe Andy?
Thanks. Yes. Thank you, Jennifer. I'll keep it short as well. One of the questions that we probably won't have time to go to later was my use of IDEA, which is part of how I define it. The common acronym is DEAI, which takes between 50 and 75% more articulatory effort to say than DEIA. So I've been working with the idea that inclusion comes first, that diversity comes first through inclusion via equity and access. So my interest started when I was working in hospitals in England in clinical, medical, biochemistry. So I went from there to teaching English. So my first many years were teaching scientific English to German postgraduates, and nobody else in the school wanted to do that because their Englishes were just so good. So I came from medical science to science teaching to language education. So that was how I navigated that route, and that's how I see them: inclusion first, and diversity, then equity and access.
That's interesting. Thank you, Andy. Deborah, Gemma, or Jack?
Sure, I'll go next. Some of the things that I think of with DEI topics or initiatives are areas of diversity that aren't always transparent or observable, or recognized as such. So sometimes there are areas of diversity that aren't legally recognized, at least in the US. So things like gender identity, sexual orientation, even for me, an area of diversity that has a lot of implications for access, especially, is socioeconomic status and economic background, of trying to ensure that people who come from different backgrounds can have access to the sometimes opaque discourses that are important for them to succeed in the future. And so I don't actually typically work with language learners per se, but with people who are, so there will be like native English speakers who also don't know the sort of like secrets of particular genres. So that's what I'm interested in.
Thank you, Jack. Yeah, Deborah?
Sure, I'll jump in. So looking at it sort of globally a little bit here, looking at DEI&A in the TESOL field, I think that it seems like a new topic, but really it isn't. The very first TESOL quarterly issue of TESOL quarterly 59 years ago, it talked about attending to justice, social justice and equity. But the words that we used then were multilingualism and multiculturalism. So 60 years ago, we were talking about this, but the words were different. And then as the field and even as the association moved along, we continued to have diversity and equity at our center. But again, the words were different. And we led the field, for example, in looking at non-native English speaking teachers, right? And attending to the value that they're bringing in. Being a native speaker of English in and of itself is not a value. And so throughout our history, we have been looking at these issues, but calling it differently and looking at it in different ways. even to the extent now where we're challenging that term, non-native English speaking teachers. So I like to look at it globally, that this is not something new, but what is new? And I think one of the things that's new for us, which is why I'm so excited about this panel, is that there has been a challenge of looking at DEI&A outside of North American context, right? Oh, that's a North American issue. You all have a lot of diversity over there, but in our country, we don't. But a big difference in our field and around the world is that now we're talking about decolonization, and formerly colonized countries and folks who are experiencing the vestiges of colonization are looking at diversity, equity, inclusion, and access in a different way. So now it's a conversation that all of us together are having. And so to bring that global point to ESP, I think that looking at ESP, I did start as an adult education teacher, and we didn't call it ESP, but I was helping them in the workplace. So now I think all around the world, in the TESOL field, in the EFL field, we are talking about diversity, equity, inclusion, and access in order to prepare our students for diverse workplaces, but also to look at DEI&A as content as well as experience. As content, what is this thing? How do I talk about DEI&A? What is the language of DEI&A? We have language of math, language of science. What's the language of DEI&A? And then finally, how our students, when they're out into the workplace, how do they experience that workplace as a diverse person or in diverse settings? Thanks.
Yeah,
Thank you,
and I'll
Deborah.
just put in at the end there, I mean, sort of going back to what Kevin was saying, also what Deborah's just said. I mean, obviously ESP is the awareness of learner needs, and how we as ESP practitioners are supposed to be helping them address these needs. And obviously if there are policies in place in institutions or in workplaces to be using, in the case of language, inclusive language or other aspects, then of course it's up to us to also be aware of this and try to foster this in our students and teach them and yeah, get them exposed to this kind of language. Also because I work at university, so perhaps then I'm doing it before they go into the workplace. So I'm looking at their future language needs, even though of course within a university setting, of course, this is also extremely relevant.
Yeah, thank you, Gemma. Thank you, everyone. So along those lines, as we know, the purpose of ESP is to prepare our students to communicate effectively in different professional and academic contexts. So for the next question, Jack, I'd like to ask you, in what ways do you believe that DEIA initiatives at educational institutions and public and private employers maybe change the way that our students need to communicate in the real world?
Yeah, so like I said before, it's not, for me, ESP, and similar to what Gemma and Deborah were just saying, it's because ESP, and even how Deborah was saying, like, we didn't call it, like, people don't always call it ESP, even though that's what it is. And how Gemma was saying, yeah, we're the ones who sort of like, our ethos is to focus on what students need, and sort of like meet that need. That we don't see ourselves as the knowers of truth or something. Like, we're trying to like bridge the gap, help them bridge the gap for themselves. Like, what is their goal? How can we help them meet that? How can we help them? And so for me, it's really common for me to see students who come from really privileged backgrounds succeed at university, and their professors in whatever discipline sort of are like, oh my gosh, this student is brilliant, this student knows how to do it. Whereas my students who come from different backgrounds, whether it be a different language background, but often it's like a different socioeconomic status background, or just come from a different perspective, don't know how to sort of like play the game. And so it's really important for me to make sure that I recognize that every student I have, and help my colleagues recognize that every student they have, come with different backgrounds. And to put bluntly, for my students who've only experienced writing instruction in English, I actually tend to have to spend more time helping them because my international students, my students who are multilingual and are used to translanguaging and working in different areas, they tend to understand this sort of like different expectations really quickly because they're used to sort of going between generic and disciplinary practices. So when it comes to DEAI, it's really primarily relevant, but not exclusive to, for me, students who come from historically underrepresented or marginalized groups, because they're using forms of language that aren't prioritized by the people in power who are grading them, who are job like bosses and these kinds of things. And so for me, there's a lot of trying to help them make those connections. And I see that as an issue of equity and sort of like how Deborah was saying with decolonization, where it's like wanting to help them work the system. So.
Thank you, Jack. Any other comments on this question? Okay, we'll go to question 3. This question we'd like to start with Deborah. So, Deborah, how do you believe that ESP practitioners can prepare students for studying and working at institutions which may have DEIA policies? Do you have any tips, suggestions for best practices?
I do, but unfortunately, I only have 30 seconds. It's a great question. So as I shared, I started out as an adult education teacher, preparing students for workplaces. Primarily, that was what we were doing. And then I was a university professor of TESOL, but really for the past 12 years, I've been in business and I've been in government. And so I have this really different experience seeing our former students rather, in these workplace environments. And whether it's corporate or government, the DEI workplace environment internationally, not just in the US, but internationally, is to be looking internally at their environment. So some of the conversations are, how many persons of a particular group do we have employed? Of that number, how many are managers? Of that number, how many have risen to the ranks of leadership? We have those conversations, looking at workplace statistics. There are DEIA trainings in just about every organization, and so you have folks coming together talking as employees, talking about diversity, equity, inclusion, and access. And those are very difficult conversations. It's especially difficult if you're coming from other cultures and coming into this new DEIA culture, corporate culture, business culture, government culture, right? So it's very complicated. And I have seen this. Businesses have affinity groups, for example, where employees of particular affinities will come together. So you'll have your LGBTQ affinity group, your Hispanic affinity group, etc. You also have within the corporate and workplace environment, you have the leadership looking at how well or not well they're doing with advancing equity within the workplace. And so my tips is my best suggestion in the 30 seconds I have, minute and a half, is to share that it is really important for us as TESOL teachers, as ESP teachers, for us to try to understand the workplace environments and to help our students begin to understand how they can investigate workplace environments that they're moving into. For example, just about every company is going to have a division of corporate social responsibility. It's different words: social responsibility, corporate social responsibility, or internally they'll even have a department of diversity, equity, inclusion, or maybe called different diverse or supplier base. There are different words, but the point is that ESP teachers can teach students to approach the workplace and DEI as content, and to begin exploring the kinds of workplaces they're going into. Go to those companies, whether they're going into hospitals or hotels, what have you. There will be, chances are, in their own profile how DEI&A is discussed, explored, and dealt with internally. And that's one of the greatest gifts I think that we can give our ESP students, is to help them learn how to explore environments that they're going to be going into. So that's probably one of the biggest tips I have. The other is, of course, if we bring in guest speakers from those environments to talk specifically about that. But again, I would say to share the idea of DEI&A as content and DEI&A as experience, because that's what our students will be heading into. So those are some thoughts. Thanks.
Thank you, Deborah. I like that. DEIA as content and as experience. Anyone else respond to that question? Yeah, go ahead, Kevin.
Thanks, Jennifer. No, I was just going to add on to what you guys have been talking about. You've been mentioning things like discourse, and you've been mentioning things, well, for me, what resonates with what you've been saying so far is performance. We're teaching our students to communicate, but we're teaching them to perform in a way to get the kinds of results that they want. And it's really interesting the way you guys are approaching it, saying to do research, saying it to find out what you should say by actually contacting people who know. So that's all I wanted to add to that. Yeah, thank you very much.
All right, thank you, Kevin. So ESP, as we know, it's a practice that is itself embedded in different educational and professional contexts. So I'd like to now ask Andy, how do you think that ESPers can help realize the DEIA initiatives of your institutions? Or in other words, how can we foster more diversity, equity, inclusion, and accessibility in our own classrooms?
Thanks, Jennifer. Again, these are all great big questions, but it's good to get the opportunity to share some thoughts with our unseen, unheard audience, which is interesting in terms of inclusion and access. A lot of my work is on context. So I think it's very important that, as well as discussing the generalities, as we've been doing here, that we look at our own contexts very carefully. In TESOL, I think we tend to, in ESP discussions, dance around the topic of race. 3 out of 4 people in the world are people of color now, Africa, India, and China alone. So to investigate from my point of view, I do a lot of work on visible minorities and, as Jack was alluding to, invisible minorities. And context is important. More than 70 million people in the US, not once but twice, voted for a hateful little man. And I don't think even my colleagues in America seem comfortable talking about that. So I think my first piece of advice, and I'll leave it there, but I've written, published, presented, and researched a lot on this, is look to your own context before you look anywhere else.
Okay, thank you, Andy. Any comments?
Yeah, I love that like it's important for us to also consider these systems of power that we might be reifying, or like being critical of these discourses and practices or performances that our students are experiencing, and not necessarily always just say, oh, this is how it's supposed to be, or this is how the powers that be say it's supposed to be. That ESP doesn't have to be completely just this prescriptive version of language education, that instead we can help our students understand that there's variation of thought, variation of performance, and teach them those abilities that allow them to have a repertoire to choose from rather than sort of like a one size fits all. And I think ESP can sort of fall into the trap of repeating colonial hegemonic systems. And so it's important for us to realize that when we're sort of designing our curricula. And yes, we want our students to know these like secret codes of how to get ahead, but that they also know that there's nothing inherently special about those codes, that they're those codes because people in power say that they're important. And so it's important for us to recognize that and to let our students know that too.
Yeah, I really appreciate the direction of the conversation, because that's really what we're talking about. We're talking about power. We're talking about language and power. And as I was sharing before, that this has been, these topics have been the point of conversation, at least in the TESOL field, pretty much from the beginning. It's just how we talk about it differs. But talking about power, I think it's really important to enable our students to understand the power that they do have. And that goes back to my point about understanding the language of DEI&A. And in the workplace, in the corporate place, business and government, our students coming in really do have the power in this milieu to talk about, well, wait a minute, there has been historical, systemic discrimination against certain groups. And look, even though we have a large percentage of employees of a certain background, where are they in the leadership? Where are they in the C-suite, right? Etc. So I think it's important not just to talk about, an environment you're going into, but to talk about the power that they bring and that they can enact and the ways that they can enact it once they're in those environments, because our students are going into very different kinds, at the moment at least, very different kinds of fields. I say at the moment at least because there can be backlash, and I think we're already seeing backlash. But I think to let them know the power that they do have. And in some ways, this is even almost applying civics education to workplace, to ESP. So that's another branch we could take, applying civics education and empowerment of the student into the ESP environment.
And I'd like to go back to what Andy was saying about context, because I teach at a university in Italy, so the majority of my students are Italian speakers. And so my focus is very much on the gender neutral language that we have in English, that obviously for Italian speakers and also German speakers are my main students. Given that their languages are grammatically gendered, of course, then the use of the pronoun he, him, etc., is something that they automatically use. And of course, the problem there is that then even within our university context, but obviously as soon as they go out into companies, international companies, if they're not aware of the fact that then saying a scientist he is not necessarily acceptable, then of course they are going to find themselves in hot water, especially as my students, particularly at this particular university, do have quite a high proficiency of English. So of course, if these kind of elements are not understood, and if they haven't sort of understood that this perhaps is not necessarily acceptable within various contexts, then of course this is something that is needed to be addressed at the level that I'm at university. So context, of course, is extremely important. And then Deborah, you were talking about power. And of course, from my perspective, using gendered language, of course, then perpetuates this unequal balance of power between men and women in this case. And so, of course, if our students can then understand that there needs to be more of a balance, therefore using, in this case, gender neutral language or more inclusive language, then of course that will also allow them to take the power that they have got into their workplace or whatever it is. So yeah.
Thank you, Gemma. I'd like us now to shift a little bit to a more practical focus and talk about how we can help our students build some of that awareness, build some of that understanding. So Kevin, I'll direct this question to you first. What effective practices for incorporating awareness, some of that understanding that we're talking about of DEIA in the ESP classroom, have you witnessed or experienced, yourself as a teacher?
Okay, and I was thinking about this kind of topic in advance also, so I'm going to refer to some of my notes. So just for brevity here, but it builds on what you guys have been saying about power, and I totally agree with it, but I've approached it a little bit differently. So in Japan, for example, I teach a class to undergraduates studying business. About 2/3 of the students are from Japan, and the other students are usually from North America, Europe, and Asia. And in the class, the students make team presentations about language and culture in the workplace. And in each presentation, they focus on one of 4 themes: politeness, identity, gender, or leadership. Now, this was from a professional communication book, but race has come up. And so that's why it was very interesting for me to hear Andy talk about that. And I asked the students to share communication strategies to achieve success in the workplaces in their countries. So for me, I want them to be equipped with linguistic power, linguistic strategies that will enable them to succeed in this case. And they share stories of their personal experiences, and in this way they teach each other. So that's one way that I approach it. And I have some very high level learners from Europe and from Japan in that class. So
Thanks, Kevin. Does anyone else have anything to share kind of in a more practical way? Things that we can do to build awareness, to build understanding in our ESP classrooms?
So I'll sort of jump in. I think that we can build on the practices that we're already doing in the classroom, right? So I think again, to my point that DEIA is nothing new. It's a different way of looking at it, and now embraced more widely. But I think teachers, that often we can trust ourselves and say, yes, what I have been doing, this is a practice, this is working well, and now what can I do to adapt it? So I would first start with that by saying, this isn't something entirely new. Oh no, now there's something else I need to learn. So that would be my starting point. And then to look at our own practices within the classroom. How are we working with our students? Who are we calling on, right? How do we arrange the environment? Do you have people sitting in rows, and some people have their backs to others, all the things that we already know about, but then build onto it the DEIA in the ways that we're talking about. And if you thinking about it as DEIA is somehow a stopping point, think about it in other ways: justice, equity, empathy in the classroom, consideration in the classroom. The other thing I would share, and this is going back to my experience working with adults, is I was always very aware that in teaching adults, I knew that I was influencing what they were bringing back to their families, and in some cases, many cases, their spouses and children. And so I think that's something to be thinking about as well as we approach, what does it mean to be in a diverse environment, an equitable environment? What does it mean for myself as a human being to live and to practice to practice inclusivity? So those kinds of conversations can also come into the classroom, knowing that we're doing more than teaching that one individual student sitting in the desk next to us.
Another thing from a practical perspective, because this morning there was the talk about gender roles in English language textbooks in Japan. And they were saying that 70 to 95% of time in school they were talking about schools, is using textbooks. As ESP practitioners, at least from my perspective, I don't use textbooks because I have to develop my courses for my own specific groups of students. So one thing I do is try to develop, when I'm developing material, try to be as inclusive as possible. So I try to, instead of then showing, I've got data here of, in economics textbooks, policymakers are male for 90-something% of the references. So what I try to do is then try to balance this out with obviously trying to make it more realistic of what is going on in life, in real life, let's say. And so I think us as ESP practitioners, because we do tend to spend a lot of time developing materials, we can do a lot by having the DEI ideas in our heads when we're actually creating these materials to somehow readdress the imbalance that there is in the published textbooks. And I think we are really in a very powerful position there.
Thank you, Gemma. Okay, I'm going to head to the last question in the interest of time. So this is a question to all the panelists, but I'd like to know, in your opinion, to what extent has ESP as a field of research and as a field of practice embraced DEIA in recent years, or Deborah, going back as far as you were mentioning earlier? And in your opinion, what still needs to be done?
Okay, sorry, in the interest of time, I'll jump in. And I took a couple of notes here as well too. Let me just get this in. I'm a graduate school MBA program admissions consultant. My role's being changed by the essay questions and interview questions to which applicants need to respond. So for example, they may be asked a question about how they will contribute to and sustain the diversity of the community, or they may be asked about an experience that changed their perspective, or they may be asked to talk about a leadership experience, and they're always asked for their goals. So I think the role of the practitioner is being changed by the needs of our learners and our desire to be effective teachers. I think that's what's driving it. We're just trying to meet that in different ways to enable them to be successful. But that's how I see what's going on.
So also to jump in. Oh, I'm sorry, Jack. Oh, okay, thank you.
Go ahead.
So I think what I would say is that, yeah, these ideas, as I've said, the ideas have been around in our field for a while, but what's different is the embracing of these ideas in the work environments that our students are heading into. That's really the big difference. And also what we see going on our televisions all the time. So I think one of the most practical things to do, and one of the gifts that we can give to our students, is to help them realize that right now we might be calling it DEI&A and the environment that they're going into. But, you know, with time, the language will change. But still the ideas are very similar. So I think that's one of the greatest gifts we can give them, is to help them to understand what's happening right now in DEI&A, but to help them understand that it will evolve for all of us, for all areas of TESOL, it will evolve. And what does that mean? And I think that's probably the most practical thing I would share. And also, you know, having said that, I don't know of anywhere where we're having a conversation like this one. Maybe someone else knows, but this is kind of new to me in this way, and I would like to see more of this done. I congratulate the panel, the panel organizers for doing this, because a lot more needs to be done talking about this and raising awareness, and especially coming down to into the ESP world. Often we see this conversation more in the association space, or we see this conversation in the elementary, secondary space, but less so, to my knowledge, in this space. So I think we need to do much more and much more exploration. Even just talking here together, we're bouncing ideas off of each other. This is all, you know, relatively newer conversations. So I think we just need more of this.
I love this. I'll sort of talk about, in terms of on the research side, as somebody who's on the editorial board for ESPJ and who reviews a lot for English for Academic, JEEP, Journal of English for Academic Purposes. So much of ESP continues to focus on academic Englishes and spaces of privileged English. Very little proportion focuses on the vast majority of how English is used around the world. And so non-academic English prioritization, I know a lot of people on this panel are really big advocates for, like, that ESP is not always EAP. Also, I would love that if there were more of a non-US or UK focus at their English as goals. All too often, there's what's seen as good or what's seen as models are very white English from North America and Great Britain. And that kind of issue of like seeing, it goes back to what I was saying about like reifying hegemonic systems. And it's sort of like I've reviewed and read articles where even the data that they've collected, similar to Gemma's point of trying to diversify our materials, they'll say they created their corpus and they only included writers whose education was done in North America to ensure that they were getting, you know, like good English. And these are people in our field who are sort of prioritizing this sort of what I see as an antiquated model of nativeness that in a lot of ways has, I don't want to say that it's to me, because so much of North American and British academia is white and a certain level of socioeconomic status, that's really giving a disservice to what English exists in the world. So my suggestion would be to broaden what we think of as good. So.
Thank you, Jack. Any final comments from you, Andy, Kevin, or Gemma? Or Kevin, you might have already gone. Andy or Gemma?
I'm sorry, what was the question?
Just what needs to be done? How should we look at this as we're looking towards the future?
Firstly, again, to thank Mike as we wrap up. It's, as I wrote in an email to the group, it's a disproportionate amount of time that it takes to make 45, 50 minutes like this happen. So that in itself is an indication that the ESP groups are taking this topic seriously. When I read the question, this particular one, I thought of Indira Gandhi, who was asked by a reporter one time, "What do you think of Western civilization?" And she said, "I think that would be an excellent idea." Didn't skip a beat. When people said that the idea of the question, I would say that of all of the many different kinds of Englishes I've worked with, starting in clinical medicine, I believe that ESP has been a little late to the game. And I was thinking, well, why is that? And then I thought of this early definition from Lyons that linguistics is the scientific study of language. And then I looked and I thought, well, which scientist? And it was all old white guys in lab coats. They were as white as their lab coats. And they had clipboards, so we know they were scientists. And then I looked at things like the book and the film, Secret Voices. So my more controversial work has challenged the very essence of what we consider scientific, because that is where ESP in our field comes from. It comes from science. John Swale's earliest works from the 70s were very much science-based. So to connect to what Jack has said and some of the other panelists have said, I think that we haven't yet been worthy of the idea of embracing ideas about diversity, equity, inclusion, and access. And I'm interested in why that is. And I think because we tend to have worshipped at the shrine of white male objectivity, which is of course nonsense, there is no objectivity, it's taken us a while to catch up. But I think panels like today help us get to where many other groups in TESOL have been for a while now.
Thank you, Andy. Mike, do we have time for one final comment from Gemma?
Yeah, I was just going to reiterate what everyone else has been saying, that I mean, I think ESP should be doing this. there should be these kind of discussions, there should be this conversation, because we're not unique. I mean, we've all got these, we have our students, we have these issues, and so the fact that we are having this conversation today, I think that is the future, that we get together and we start properly discussing these topics.
Thank you, Gemma. Thank you, everyone, to participating on this panel, and for everyone who's here in our audience. As we can see, there's a lot of work to be done, but I think this was a good start. Thank you for the engaging conversation, and good luck on the rest of the convention.